Before paper, civilization had a memory problem. Every law, every discovery, every story had to be carved into clay, painted onto fragile papyrus, or written on expensive animal skin. Knowledge was heavy, difficult to copy, and far too costly for most people to own. Then, in a small workshop in ancient China, someone held up a thin sheet made from bark, old rags, and worn-out fishing nets. It looked ordinary, but that single invention would carry the world's greatest ideas, spread religions, fuel revolutions, preserve history, and change the future of every civilization that touched it. So how did a humble sheet of paper become one of the most powerful inventions in human history? This is the history of paper. Lu Yang, 105 CE. A government official named Cai Lun is standing in a workshop on the outskirts of the Han imperial capital, holding a thin, pale sheet up to the light. It is made from bark, from hemp, from old fishing nets and worn-out rags, soaked, beaten, pressed, and dried. It is lighter than silk, cheaper than bamboo, and it holds ink the way nothing before it has. He has no name for what he is holding. We would call it paper. That is where our story begins, though the story, as it turns out, goes further back than Cai Lun, and much further forward than anyone standing in that Luoyang workshop could have imagined. Paper is one of those inventions so thoroughly woven into the fabric of daily life that we have stopped seeing it. It sits on our desks, lines our walls, wraps our food, carries our money, and holds our laws. It is the surface on which human civilization has done most of its thinking for nearly 2,000 years. And if you trace it back, really back, it leads not just to a Chinese workshop, but to the deeper question of what it means for a civilization to be able to remember itself. Before paper, that was harder than you might think. The Mesopotamian solution to writing was clay. Scribes pressed wedge-shaped marks into wet clay tablets using a cut reed, cuneiform, one of the earliest writing systems in human history, dating to around 3200 BCE. Clay tablets are durable, extraordinarily durable. We have hundreds of thousands of them surviving today, including shopping lists, love letters, and administrative records from 4,000 years ago. The problem was not preservation, it was a scale. A clay tablet is heavy. A large administrative archive is very heavy. Moving information from one place to another required moving the clay itself. The Egyptians solved the problem differently. By around 3000 BCE, Egyptian scribes were producing papyrus, sheets made from the pith of the papyrus plant, which grew abundantly in the Nile Delta. Strips of pith were laid in overlapping perpendicular layers, pressed and dried, until they fused into a writing surface. Papyrus was lighter than clay. It could be rolled into scrolls. A single messenger could carry a significant volume of text on his back. The Mediterranean world ran on papyrus for 3,000 years. But papyrus had limits. The papyrus plant did not grow everywhere. It required specific conditions, the shallow, slow-moving waters of the Nile Delta, and when those conditions were absent, papyrus became expensive, controlled, and occasionally weaponized. In the 3rd century BCE, when Egypt temporarily restricted papyrus exports to suppress a rival library at Pergamon in modern-day Turkey, the Pergamene developed their own writing surface, processed animal skin, scraped thin and stretched smooth. They called it Pergamon, from the city's name. We call it parchment. Parchment was durable. It could be folded without cracking, unlike papyrus. It could be scraped clean and reused. A well-made piece of parchment could last centuries. Medieval European monks writing on vellum, the finest grade of parchment, made from calfskin, produced manuscripts that survive today in perfect condition after 800 years. But parchment came from animals. A single large Bible required the skins of approximately 250 calves. The great monastic libraries of medieval Europe were, among other things, enormous consumers of livestock. Knowledge, in the parchment era, had a direct relationship with animal husbandry. The number of books a civilization could produce was partly determined by how many calves it could raise. That was the world into which paper arrived. The earliest paper we have physical evidence of predates Cai Lun by roughly a century. Archaeological finds from Chinese sites, including the Dunhuang region, have produced paper fragments dated to the 2nd century BCE, thin, rough sheets used for wrapping rather than writing. Paper, in its earliest Chinese forms, was a packaging material. Cai Lun's contribution was not the invention of paper. It was the refinement and standardization of the process, and, critically, his position as a court official who could bring the technology to imperial attention. In 105 CE, he presented his improved paper to Emperor He of Han, who was so impressed that he issued a court decree promoting the material for official use. In Chinese historical tradition, Cai Lun is credited as the father of paper. More precisely, he was the bureaucrat who got paper promoted to the top of the government procurement list. Without the imperial endorsement, the technology might have remained a workshop curiosity for another century. With it, paper spread across China with remarkable speed. Within 2 centuries, paper had replaced bamboo, which had been the dominant writing surface in China. In government records, correspondence, and literary texts, the practical advantages were decisive. Bamboo slips were bulky and heavy. One Han-era history records that an official was given a cart of bamboo slips to transport, a task requiring an ox. The equivalent amount of text on paper could have been carried in a satchel. The portability of paper was not just a convenience. It was an administrative revolution. Paper also changed who could participate in written culture. Silk, which had also served as a luxury writing surface in China, was expensive. Only the wealthy could write on silk. Paper, manufactured from cheap raw materials, bark, rags, hemp, straw, was something different. It was the first writing surface in Chinese history that was cheap enough to be used by ordinary scholars, minor officials, and merchants. The democratization of writing in China, the expansion of literacy and record-keeping beyond the elite, tracked closely with the spread of paper. If you can afford the brush and the ink, paper will find a way to be cheap enough. The technology moved west slowly. Paper-making knowledge reached Central Asia through the expansion of Tang Dynasty influence and through the movement of craftsmen and prisoners along the Silk Road. The Battle of Talas in 751 CE, a clash between Tang Chinese forces and the Abbasid Caliphate near what is now Kyrgyzstan, resulted in Chinese prisoners being taken west. Among them, according to Arab historians writing several decades later, were paper makers. Whether the account is precisely accurate or somewhat legendary, the paper industry in Samarkand expanded dramatically in the decade following the battle. From Samarkand, paper production moved to Baghdad. Under the Abbasid Caliphate, and particularly under the reign of the Caliph Harun al-Rashid in the late 8th century, Baghdad became the intellectual capital of the world. The House of Wisdom, Beit al-Hikmah, was a library, translation center, and research institution of extraordinary scope. Greek, Persian, Indian, and Chinese texts were translated into Arabic. Scholars from across the Islamic world gathered to study astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and philosophy, and the paper mills of Baghdad supplied the material on which all of this was written. The Islamic Golden Age was a paper age. Without cheap, abundant writing material, the translation movement would have been constrained. The great works of al-Khwarizmi, who gave us algebra and the concept of the algorithm, were written on paper. The medical encyclopedias of Ibn Sina, Avicenna, which would guide European medicine for centuries, were written on paper. The maps of Al-Idrisi, the poetry of Rumi, the philosophical works of Ibn Rushd, all paper. The Arabic papermaking tradition refined the Chinese process. Arab papermakers developed starch sizing, coating paper with a starch solution to make it smoother and less absorbent, which improved the quality of ink applied to the surface. They also expanded the range of raw materials used in production. By the 10th century, Arab paper mills across Persia, Iraq, Syria, and Egypt were supplying a reading public of remarkable scale. Europe was watching. Paper arrived in Europe through two routes, through Arab-controlled Sicily and through the Iberian Peninsula, where the long period of Islamic rule, Al-Andalus, had established paper mills by the 11th century. The first paper mill in Christian Europe was established in Fabriano, Italy, in 1276, and it was in Fabriano that European papermakers made their own critical contributions. The watermark was a Fabriano innovation. A design pressed into the paper mold left a translucent mark visible when the sheet was held to light. Watermarks identified the mill and the paper grade. They were the earliest form of what we would now call branding, a quality guarantee embedded in the product itself. The watermarks of medieval Fabriano paper survive in manuscripts across Europe, traceable by scholars today to specific mills, specific periods, specific grades of paper. The paper makers of Fabriano also developed rag processing techniques that produced a harder, more durable paper than previous Arab methods. European paper had to withstand the mechanical stress of the printing press, which the Chinese and Arab traditions had not needed to account for. The physical demands of Gutenberg's press, introduced around 1450, required paper that would not tear under the pressure of metal type. Gutenberg's press and European paper arrived together, and together they changed everything. Before printing, a single manuscript Bible might take a monk 18 months to copy by hand. After printing, the same text could be reproduced in days, in editions of hundreds or thousands, but the press required paper in industrial quantities. The growth of the printing industry from 1450 onward drove a parallel expansion of European paper production that lasted 3 centuries. By 1500, there were paper mills in virtually every major European country. By 1600, millions of books, pamphlets, broadsides, and official documents were circulating across the continent. Paper made the Protestant Reformation possible in the same way it had made the Islamic Golden Age possible, by making ideas cheap to reproduce. The 18th century confronted an unexpected crisis. Rag paper, all paper up to that point was made from cloth rags, was running out of supply. The printing industry had grown faster than the rag trade could support. Governments across Europe issued public appeals for citizens to donate rags to paper mills. In some countries, laws were passed regulating the export of rags. The material on which civilization's memory was written was in shortage. The solution was wood pulp. Friedrich Gottlob Keller, a German weaver, demonstrated in 1844 that wood could be ground into a pulp and formed into paper. The chemistry was refined by Canadian inventor Charles Fenerty and others working simultaneously. By the 1860s, wood pulp paper was being produced at an industrial scale. The raw material had shifted from worn cloth to trees, and the supply constraint effectively disappeared. Wood pulp paper had one significant drawback: it decays faster than rag paper. The acids produced by wood cellulose cause paper to yellow and become brittle over decades. The great newspaper archives of the 19th and early 20th centuries are crumbling in ways that medieval parchment manuscripts are not. The very abundance of wood pulp paper created a preservation problem that archivists are still working to solve today. Acid-free paper, developed in the 20th century, partially addresses this problem. But the newspapers of 1890 and the mass-market paperback novels of 1950 are deteriorating in library collections across the world at rates that concern historians deeply. And then came the digital revolution, and the death of paper was declared. It did not die. Global paper production peaked in 2013 and has declined modestly since, but the world still produces approximately 400 million tons of paper per year. The paperless office, predicted confidently from the 1970s onward, has not materialized. Offices use more paper than they did before computing. The brain processes information differently from a printed page than from a screen. Studies in reading comprehension consistently show advantages for text printed on paper for complex material. Paper, it turns out, has cognitive properties that the screen has not replicated. And beyond the utilitarian, there is something else. Paper has a meaning that pulped wood cannot fully account for. A letter written by hand on paper is a different object from an email. A printed photograph is a different artifact than an image on a phone. A signed document, a contract, a certificate, a declaration, carries a physical authority that a digital signature has not quite supplanted, despite decades of effort by legal systems to make it so. The Magna Carta survives on parchment. The Declaration of Independence survives on parchment. The original manuscript of the King James Bible survives on paper. The things we have decided matter most, we have committed to physical surfaces that outlast the people who made them. Cai Lun, standing in his Luoyang workshop in 105 CE, holding his thin, pale sheet up to the light, understood something essential that has not changed in 2,000 years. Paper is not a surface, it is a commitment. When you write something down, you are betting that it will outlast the moment of its writing. You are making a small argument against forgetting. You are saying, this happened, this was thought, this was agreed to, this was true. Civilization's memory is made of exactly that. Thousands of years of small arguments against forgetting, pressed into bark and hemp and rags and wood, and held up to the light. Next story will uncover the hidden history of the clock, and how humanity transformed the sun, the stars, and finally the ticking of tiny gears into something that rules every second of our lives. Because before clocks, time wasn't measured, it was simply endured.